wondered, from your experience, how have you seen that story start to unpack, and what roles have you seen for the private sector in terms of those sorts of relationships between trying to get a development agenda and an enterprise agenda to stack up together?
I think in the development community, there is a strong recognition now of the power of the market, and that you're never going to have enough money as a DFID to do more than be catalytical. And one of the big, not the only catalyst, but one of the big catalysts is a market-driven catalyst. So I think there is just a recognition, the economic power of the bottom billion. If you have that many people who are buying that many bags of ugali, that amounts to something significant. I also think, and DFID has actually played a role, dynamic role in this, but in the banking sector we see a lot of innovations. When you can have index-linked crop insurance or index-linked livestock insurance, that's pretty revolutionary for the small farmer, because it means that instead of relying just on the gods to provide the rain at just the right points, that somehow their crop or their cattle are collateralized, and that means they may not have the full value that they would have in the market. They have 60–70% of that value, and that means that they can then go and take a bank loan out, maybe get a bull who will improve the quality of their livestock, or maybe get high quality grains, and maybe a bit more fertilizer, or school fees for their kids. So it becomes a positive virtuous cycle, and not, as we have it at the moment, a very fragile one.
We've been looking at sort of different models of entrepreneurship, and the extent to which different sorts of agencies can bring those entrepreneurial skills to bear. And I wondered if you got a sense that actually there were different sorts of entrepreneurial models that were starting to emerge in your travels that you'd picked up. Do you get a sense of that?
In the NGO sector, I think where you can have a huge effect is on cooperative movement. I think you see cooperatives, particularly the ones which are producing staple crops, tea and coffee and so on, that they can actually have a really, if you can make them a little bit more entrepreneurial, that can have a big filter down effect. I haven't seen on the ground, I've seen, micro loans to women in urban environments. That has a very big win-win effect. I'm a little bit skeptical in the countryside, actually. I think much of the stuff that's happening seems to me to be happening simply because some Kikuyu guy has done the numbers on the back of an envelope and knows it's a good idea, right? I'm not that convinced that the NGO sector is. I might be wrong, because that's not my expertise.
We'll come back to that, and I'm sure there'll be some observations around that. Well, let's look at the other end of the sort of business spectrum then, and some of the ways in which those cooperatives might be working. Alan Duncan, in his speech recently, started to talk about SAB Miller and an example of crops being grown in southern Sudan and import substitution around those, and actually thinking around the way in which those issues could play out. And I wondered how you see that as a sort of an example of a positive set of interventions, really, in terms of the way in which. What's your view around that? What's the role of investing in the brewing industry and some of the issues that sit behind?
You mean should Her Majesty's government be subsidising South African breweries?
Well, that's if that's the way you want to take it. Because there seems to be a sort of an expectation amongst those large organisations that sorting out of cooperatives, that setting up of supply chains, is a job for the voluntary sector. It isn't something that they should be in any way involved with. They may well benefit from it, but there's sort of a market readiness that needs to be there before they can come in.
Well, I don't know how much money you guys have available, or what kind of prioritisation you take. But just pulling back, I think if that's what it takes to get it done, I mean, I'm sure there was different money involved in Safaricom setting up the M-Pesa scheme, which I'll really go out on the limb and say that's probably done more, fiscally speaking, than the entire aid sector to Kenya has done since independence. I would go that far, you know.
Wow, okay.
But if a part of that inception, at some stage, maybe some mobile phone executive would say, well, you know, that's 50,000 quid. We're not going to spend 50,000 quid looking at that, you know. So I think, you know, it's just about having, you know, your chips at the poker table and saying, okay, how can I play with these chips the best possible? Sometimes maybe it is a good idea to actually go with a big corporation and say, we're going to help you to do this because we think there's a huge value in it. But obviously there has to be a degree of skepticism as to whether you are doing things that they could afford to do anyway, you know, and they're perfectly capable of doing anyway. So, you know.
But so, I mean, one of our really sort of interesting points of discussion this morning was around actually how you create the sort of a level of accountability and the flexibility to be able to go do those deals, because actually
it's tough,
you
isn't
need to be quite fleet of foot to be able to be in the right place. Because if it takes you 9 months to go through your processes, actually the private sector sort of get bored, and they either they might find another way, or they get bored, or they move on to something else. So I think that's a real challenge that sits behind that ability to be able to intervene at a point at which you can really make a difference.
Well, you know, urgency is the one thing that I don't know whether I succeed, but I think in my stories, the one. And this is if there's one point to take out of this discussion, it's this point, it is that the population demographic dividend is there. It has enormous potential for Africa. But believe me, if you don't take advantage of it, especially when you add in the effects of denuded soils, denuded landscapes, and possibly climate change, especially in more arid regions in Africa, and the doubling in, if you don't take advantage of it, you're looking at cataclysmic future for Africa. There's no question about that, you know. And I know that and I always get this criticism from my African friends that maybe I'm being too negative and having, the hopeless continent, which the Economist is constantly crucified in a stupid cover story which we ran several years ago. Nothing to do with me. But you have to put that sense of urgency. And that's very true of the development sector too. It's simply utterly intolerable, inexcusable in the 21st century, in the challenges that this continent faces, that you could have a 9-month layover on disbursement of funds. That is a non-starter. That is tantamount to saying intellectually, we're not relevant. We're not going to contribute. Because you need to be putting those funds in on a 2-month cycle,